Welcome to my video on tackling unemployment and inflation. The natural rate of unemployment occurs at labour market equilibrium. Let's see why. Any further, it is worth noting down the following definitions. Equilibrium unemployment, also known as the natural rate of unemployment. Although there may be overall macroeconomic equilibrium, with the aggregate demand for labour equal to the aggregate supply of labour, and thus no disequilibrium unemployment, in other words here, at a micro level, supply and demand may not match. Even when the labour market is in equilibrium, not everyone looking for work will be employed. Some people will hold out, looking to find a better job. Curve N shows the total number of people in the labour force. The horizontal difference between it and the aggregate supply of labour, ASL, represents the excess of people looking for work over those actually willing to accept jobs. So this distance all the way along. QE represents the equilibrium level of employment, and distance D to E represents the equilibrium level of unemployment. This is sometimes known as the natural level or natural rate of unemployment. You should note as well that the ASL curve gets closer to N, so the distance gets closer to N at higher wages. The reason for this is that the unemployed will be more willing to accept jobs, the higher the wages that are offered. Although there may be some overall macroeconomic equilibrium, with the aggregate demand for labour equal to the aggregate supply, and thus no disequilibrium unemployment, at a micro level, as I've already said, supply and demand may not match. For instance, there may be vacancies for computer technicians and unemployment in the steel industry, but unemployed steelworkers cannot immediately become computer technicians. This is when equilibrium unemployment will occur. There are three types of equilibrium unemployment: frictional, structural, and seasonal. So before going any further, it's important that we consider the real wage. So have a quick look at the information I've just put in front of you now. So here you can see the diagram in front of you shows disequilibrium unemployment. For disequilibrium unemployment to occur, two conditions must hold. First, the aggregate supply of labour must exceed the aggregate demand. And second, there must be stickiness in wages. In other words, the wage rate must not immediately fall to WE, the market clearing wage. There are three causes of disequilibrium unemployment. The first is real wage unemployment. This is where trade unions use their monopoly power to drive wages above the market clearing level. Another example can be the government setting the national minimum wage too high above the market clearing level. However, high real wage rates can have a positive effect, as they may actually help to reduce real wage unemployment. The extra wages paid to those who are still employed could lead to extra consumer expenditure. The short-run Phillips curve shows an inflation and unemployment trade-off. The SRPC shows an apparent trade-off between inflation and unemployment. By plotting historical inflation and unemployment data, the economist A.W. Phillips found that as inflation falls, unemployment seems to rise and vice versa. So it looks like if the government wants to reduce unemployment, then it can increase aggregate demand to achieve this, as long as it's prepared to accept higher inflation. However, not everyone agrees that it's quite that simple. One problem is that once inflation has gone up, people seem to expect it to remain high, and they change their behaviour accordingly. This is the idea of adaptive expectations. That is, people using the past to predict what's going to happen in the future. So if inflation is high today, then people will expect it to be high tomorrow as well. This can lead to high inflation becoming embedded in an economy, even if the government is trying to reduce it. Keynesian economists say the Phillips curve relationship is basically true. The Phillips curve shows the same idea as appears in the curved section of a Keynesian LRAS curve. That is, below point A, which you can see on the screen, that's where output is low and unemployment is high, workers will take jobs even if the wages are low. Output increases thus with little effect on inflation. Between A and B, as output increases and unemployment falls, there is an increase in prices, i.e. inflation. This is the same relationship as the one shown on the Phillips curve. The Phillips curve relationship has sometimes broken down. In the 50s and 60s, governments used the Phillips curve to try and manage the trade-off between inflation and unemployment. However, in the 1970s, the relationship between unemployment and inflation seemed to break down. There was a period of stagflation. A stagnant economy is where there's low growth and high unemployment as well as high inflation. It was monetarist economists who put forward an explanation for this. They said that the short-run Phillips curve only takes into account the current rate of inflation. It doesn't take into account the influence of the expected rate of inflation. That's where the long-run Phillips curve comes in. Expectations about inflation can cause inflation rises to become embedded. Assume that an economy that's at point A on the diagram has unemployment at its natural rate, UN. That's the NRU. At point A, inflation is 0%. So the economic agents, that's workers, firms, etc., in the economy will expect that inflation will stay at 0%, and this will influence things like workers' wage negotiations. However, if aggregate demand increases and this forces unemployment below the NRU, this will cause wage demands to go up and inflation will increase to 3%. At point B, economic agents will now expect inflation to stay at 3%. As a result, future wage negotiations will be based on inflation being at 3%. Higher wage demands will mean firms are less willing to take on workers, so unemployment will rise back to the NRU, that's point UN. So the short-run Phillips curve 1 will shift right to short-run Phillips curve 2. When the short-run Phillips curve 1 shifts right to SRPC 2 and the economy is at point C, you can see that despite unemployment returning to the NRU, an inflation rate of 3% has become embedded in the economy. Further increases in aggregate demand will mean that the higher inflation rates can become embedded in the economy. This shows how important it is for governments to use policies that stop inflation rising continuously. In the UK, the Bank of England is tasked with keeping inflation close to the target rate of 2%, so that the expectations of economic agents are based on 2% inflation. On top of this, governments will use policies to lower unemployment and lower the NRU. Monetarist economists say there is no trade-off between inflation and unemployment. In the example we've just looked at, the increase in AD caused inflation to rise. However, there was no long-term effect on unemployment. This eventually returned to the natural rate of unemployment, and that's the key bit of information there. There is no long-term effect on unemployment as we return back to the NRU. This idea led the monetarist economists who first suggested the idea of adaptive expectations to conclude that there was no long-term link between inflation and unemployment. That is, no matter how the SRP shifts, unemployment always returns to the NRU. So, the long-run Phillips curve, the LRPC, will always be a vertical line coming up from UN. This means that in the long run there is no trade-off between unemployment and inflation. In fact, many economists say the short-run Phillips curve relationship, that is, that you can trade off inflation against unemployment in the short run, doesn't even exist either. The significance of the Phillips curve isn't clear. Supply-side policies may mean that low unemployment and low inflation can exist at the same time. However, at times it does seem that the unemployment-inflation trade-off does exist. In practice, the Phillips curve is now only used in the short-run economic policy making. So if I just show you my notes, and you can find these in Google Classroom, you can see there's our short-run Phillips curve. Nice clear trade-off between inflation and unemployment. If I scroll down, you can see that over the longer term, the trade-offs seem to break down. There is no clear line of best fit going on. Moreover, you can see this sort of pattern emerge. So there is no clear line going down throughout of a nice trade-off because it is all circular. So this leads us to a very good evaluative tool, I believe. This shows us the phases of the inflation, the unemployment cycle. So just take a moment to note that down. So the stagflation phase you'll find in the 1970s. Well, that would make sense because there was high inflation, because the price of oil had gone up because of wars in the Middle East. So there was large degrees of cost push inflation and high degrees of unemployment. The recovery phase, well, that would appear to be what happened in the noughties, low inflation and low levels of unemployment. Demand-side policies can reduce cyclical unemployment. Economists argue that over the theory of how an economy works, governments have to get on with the practical business of making the policies. Here's some of the issues they face and the solutions that they can try to use. To reduce unemployment, governments need to understand what type of unemployment they're trying to tackle. During a recession, an economy is likely to have cyclical unemployment, so a government would need to introduce policies that boost aggregate demand. For example, reflationary fiscal policies that decrease tax or increase welfare payments, or expansionary monetary policies such as lowering of interest rates. However, there are problems with these kinds of demand-side policies. A lack of information, for instance, about the size of the economy's output gap may mean that the government overspends when it tries to boost aggregate demand and causes the economy to overshoot or overheat, leading to inflation. Alternatively, the government might underspend and prolong a recession. A lack of information about the size of the multiplier can cause problems too. For example, if the multiplier in a country is bigger than the government expects, then an increase in government spending could cause inflation. It's hard for a government to use demand-side policies to fine-tune the economy. They can be quite clumsy and cause more problems. Time lags also mean that the improvements are slow to develop. Governments may think that their policies aren't working, so they increase spending further and create inflation. Supply-side policies reduce the natural rate of unemployment. That is, imagine we have the Phillips curve diagram side by side with the AD and AAS diagram. If we have a successful supply-side policy, you are clear that the LRAS will shift to the right. Well, at the same time, what's going to happen on the long-run Phillips curve diagram is that the LRPC will shift to the left. This illustrates that we can get a reduction in the natural rate of unemployment. So, supply-side policies will reduce the natural rate of unemployment. To reduce the NRU, governments need to use supply-side policies that make the labour market more flexible and reduce frictional and structural unemployment. The flexibility of labour is determined by three factors: labour mobility, wage flexibility, and the flexibility of working conditions. Let's start with labour mobility. That is the ability of workers to switch jobs easily. The more transferable skills workers have, the more easy they can switch jobs. So labour mobility will depend on how skilled workers are. On top of that, labour mobility will also depend on the willingness of workers to move to where there are jobs. Wage flexibility. That is the ability of wages to change with changes to the labour market. For instance, respond to supply and demand. For example, during a recession, employers can lower wages to avoid having to lay workers off. Flexibility of working arrangements. The ability of employers to hire workers in a way that suits them. Things such as part-time work, short-time contracts, or even zero-hour contracts, and shift employment make it easier and cheaper for firms to hire or fire workers and respond to changes in the market. So policies that improve labour market flexibility will focus on improving all three of these. For example, labour mobility can be tackled by the same policies that are used to reduce structural unemployment. Governments can improve wage flexibility by scrapping the NMW, the National Minimum Wage, and limiting trade union power. The flexibility of working arrangements could be improved if the government passed laws that made it easier for firms to hire workers on short-term or zero-hour contracts. Frictional unemployment will be reduced by policies which encourage people to find a job and speed up that process. Reducing benefits will give unemployed workers a greater incentive to find a job, and it will help the government avoid the unemployment trap, where unemployed workers are better off than those working on low wages. Income tax cuts will increase the incentive for workers to find a job or encourage them to work longer hours. Increased information about jobs will help workers find the right job for themselves more quickly. Structural unemployment will be reduced by policies which tackle geographical and occupational immobility. Governments can improve occupational mobility by investing in training schemes that help workers to improve their skills, or by encouraging firms to set up their own training schemes. Geographical immobility can be tackled by giving workers subsidies to move to different areas, or by building affordable houses in areas that need workers. However, workers will still often be reluctant to leave their homes and families. Governments can bring jobs to areas with high unemployment by providing benefits to firms that locate in certain areas, such as tax breaks. Also, this might be combined with training schemes to give local workers the skills required for the jobs provided. Monetary policy is used to tackle demand pull inflation. Governments also need to use policies that deal with demand pull and cost push inflation. Monetary policy is used to tackle the demand pull inflation, while supply side policies, which we noted above, are not only used to tackle frictional and structural unemployment, but are used to tackle cost push inflation. We will look at this in our supply side policies video.